So, welcome back to Third Age Reforged and to another battle replay and to another custom scenario that has been in the works by Flame of Arnor and a few other people. I think this is technically the last one of this current batch that we're going to be showing. There was another one that I got sent as well, but that was more of a rework and reimagining of the fairly recent Numenor saving of their own fortress. So we will get to that one as well, but it will be a little bit further down the line because it's very similar, of course, and we don't want to be repeating ourselves too much in a short space of time. But this one, of course, is Dwarven inspired, and more than that, it is focused around the dwarves of ERED LUIN, the dwarves of the Blue Mountains. This one is somewhat similar perhaps to the other mountainous one with the dwarves we saw recently as well, in the sense that you've got the attacking forces, you've got the elves who are attacking the dwarves here. So I mean, again, the forces of the good side of Middle-earth, but this one is based around the idea of ERED LUIN accepting the rings from Sauron. So technically, ERED LUIN are going to be the forces of evil today. We can see several of their armies here in this central passageway as they make their way back towards their fortress, but they are going to be set upon really very quickly by the forces of Lindon, and we also saw some of the forces of the Shire as well. So an interesting matchup. Certainly the attackers and defenders today are going to have very different focuses in terms of what makes their armies tick. I think that ERED LUIN's solidity should serve them pretty well here, and Lindon, while they do have better melee attack and defense overall, I mean, ERED LUIN are good enough in that regard to at least be able to hang with them, and then you've of course got the armour to back it up as well. But they do find themselves in a relatively disadvantaged position quite early on here. It's not the longest battle either for one of these custom scenarios. 25k frames, nearly 26 is relatively short given the scale of things, but then they are so close to one another and the vast majority of the battle is going to happen very quickly, I think, so there's not really going to be any sort of preamble. There is technically a town centre over here, but I don't think it's active, and it'll be interesting to see actually how much of a role this fortress plays in proceedings. But I don't really know. I guess we'll go through the red team first and foremost, because they are far more the attackers, I would suggest, than the blue team, who are just going to be trying to survive this ambush. So we'll start with Mevon, albeit we're not going to be able to see too much of the Shire's army because so much of it can hide. Battling Brandybucks, I mean, one thing that the Shire don't lack for is actually a good amount of armour piercing, which will come in handy against the dwarves that they're facing off against today, albeit of course the quality and the survivability of the individual hobbits is far less than an individual dwarf, but still the accent of all of their armour piercing should mesh quite nicely with the quality that the elves can bring to bear in this sort of situation. Of course, many of the ranged units that the hobbits have as well, they've got slingers and crossbows that will probably be making an appearance as well. So surprisingly vicious as a fighting force and awkward to deal with. ERED LUIN will be hoping to get them in a more organised fight, because then that's where the hobbits could start to struggle a little bit, but we'll see more from that army, I'm sure, as the battle goes along. But as for the first Lindon army, we have Arbiter, who has got some Harlanden infantry here. So again, the interplay between Lindon and ERED LUIN is going to be one of the keys behind this fight, I think, given the fact that Lindon do have that really good melee defense and attack, but low armor, very low armor. But how important is that going to be? Because I think much of the fight is going to take place in close quarters from a relatively early point in the battle, and that's how Lindon will want it, albeit ERED LUIN can, as I said, hang with them in terms of quality. One thing that ERED LUIN will be quite worried about is taking charges from a unit like the Horse Lords of Ulmo. Very, very dangerous. ERED LUIN do have mounted units of their own, but in the dwarven fashion for the game, the monstrous cavalry, as you would call it, very heavy mass, but relatively slow. And this is where the Horse Lords of Ulmo could dance around them again. Depends on how much room they really have. It's a relatively wide open map, so it's going to be key, I think, for those lancers to get some good charges off at the very least. More Harlanden infantry. I mean, interestingly enough, they're carrying a ladder right from the off. That's only really going to be relevant later, I think, if the fortress comes into effect. Already, I mean, there's not really even going to be any sort of cut at the start of this battle, because the Lindar bowmen are already reloading, and this was as soon as the deployment phase ended. So yeah, I mean, they're going to be able to shoot immediately. But one thing that ERED LUIN do have is the ability to respond with their own strong archers, and the problem Lindon have is light armour, of course, and ERED LUIN do have that armour. So I think from an elongated skirmishing phase is not what Lindon want, but certainly the assistance from their high damage arrows will be the sort of thing which can help units like this, the Mithlond Swordmasters, obviously the Elven two-handed swords, across all of the Elven factions are a very important part of what they do, because huge damage and of course huge melee defense, and Lindon especially because they can mass them up a little bit more. Mithlond Swordmasters will be very useful against the dwarves here alongside the shielded Harlenden infantry here. Something else that they have in their favour as well is pikes. Lindon's pikes are very vulnerable to skirmishing, but again, if they can get themselves set up, the Mithlond pikemen can be massed up more easily than other Elven pikes. They may not have the survivability of the Imladris and Lothlorien variants, but you can have more of them, which in terms of blanketing the field with pikes is often a little bit more useful in a situation like this, I think, especially when you're hopefully going to have less of a problem with enemy projectiles, because you can get in there pretty quickly. More Mithlond Swordmasters as well, who of course are also pretty damn vulnerable to arrows too. More Harland infantry, more Harlenden infantry and Mithlond pikes, so nothing too out of the ordinary here. Plenty of these. We've got the Mithlond Marines as well. Something else that Lindon can have in their favour is javelins. I mean, this is going to be, again, an interesting tit for tat, because ERED LUIN have got their own answer to a unit like this. But again, the armour piercing that they offer up close is going to be important as well, and of course they are pretty good in melee too. Harlenden infantry, and then of course we have the Noldorin Guard, which are the armoured variants that Lindon have access to, the Noldorin class units. Very, very strong, not too dissimilar actually to ERED LUIN in terms of having that armour and high quality stats approach, but in Lindon's case it is going to be even more of that quality meshed with that armour, albeit they're going to be here in lower numbers. Here in the north we have Mevon again. We've got Hobbitry in Arms battling Brandybucks with their scythes, so again the Hobbitry in Arms do have that bit of armour piercing, but the quality is not necessarily there. And then more, I mean, plenty of siege equipment here for the attacking forces. More Hobbitry in Arms as well. Moto has got all of his Lindon forces very much concentrated over here, so they're going to be pursuing ERED LUIN directly as the ambush happens. And then we've got some Harlenden infantry, more Noldorin Guard. Pretty much the same sort of situation here, I would suggest, with pikes, Mithlond Swordmasters, Harlenden infantry being the vast majority of the army. A few skirmishers with the Lindar bowmen and probably some Mithlond Marines as well, all tied together with some Noldorin Guard. And then over here we have a force of humans. Arthedain are going to be alongside Lindon and the Hobbits today, which I think is good because it gives them a little bit more of a different dynamic. They do have, of course, the armour, not necessarily as high as ERED LUIN's, but they're a little bit more of a workhorse kind of army, which can help Lindon as they pursue the dwarves here. Arthedain man-at-arms, albeit without the armour upgrade. Arthedain don't lack for pikes either, so that's going to be a challenge for ERED LUIN to deal with. All of these long pointy sticks are going to be an issue if they can't get around them or bust their formation. Arthedain pikemen with the armour, again a little bit more rigid perhaps than the Mithlond pikemen, but just not quite as high quality, albeit there are more of them as well, which is often an important trait for a unit like this, which relies on formations. Arthedain spearmen. Again, we also have the Knights of Annuminus in here, so again another very deadly unit of cavalry. Arthedain men-at-arms, plenty of these units all packed tightly together. We've got the High Lords of Annuminus, who in terms of sheer stats are one of the best units of sword and board infantry in the game. They could even be the best, depending on what you're looking for. I'd suggest probably the Mithril Guard still hold that title, but the High Lords of Annuminus are not a million miles away from them. Albeit there are slightly less of them as well, I believe, off the top of my head, but not a foe they will have to fight in this battle anyway. ERED LUIN have certain other units they will be worried about. Another force of elves on this side as well from Ricky Beagle. I would imagine something similar, Harlenden infantry, several units of them, in addition to the more dangerous Mithlond Swordmasters, and then of course the Mithlond pikemen to anchor everything in place as they slam into the dwarves from both sides. More units of them. Harlenden infantry. We've got the Lindar Mariners this time, so this is another unit of javelins, albeit they're spears in melee. Don't know, you'd probably prefer the Mithlond Marines for the swords in melee, but the javelins are the most important thing here to help crack through that dwarven plate. Harlenden infantry once again. More Noldorin Guard. No Noldorin Swordmasters by the looks of things, but the Guard do have those shields, which is nice. Harlenden Riders, so a unit of horse archers on this side, not as dangerous as the Horse Lords of Ulmo, but again just one of those units where if you can use them well, they will be able to ratchet up a pretty decent kill count for themselves over the long haul. Banderbrass archers, the skin changers as well. An important unit this, monstrous infantry, even the dwarven survivability will be put to the test severely by them. They're one of the better units of monstrous infantry in the game. Now then, as for ERED LUIN, I mean we'll start off in the fortress because there's only one unit here. and that will be covering a advancing dwarven force as the opposition pursues them, I would suppose, with the Frostling Thrower. Obviously very similar to the Whatcher, but perhaps even more so to the Ribolt from baseline Medieval 2. It uses basically the same model after all. So they're going to be firing at the enemy as the dwarves try to run for cover, as of course will the 2 stone giants. Javelins will be their main worry, but yeah, very, very tough for regular units to bring them down, but they're still a fair ways away. I mean, the battle I think is going to be largely decided from over here. We have Colonel Speaks, who has got the Juggernauts. This is the best unit of out-and-out infantry that the Dwarves of the Blue Mountains have. Armor-piercing, dual-wielding, very heavily armoured. One of the most well-rounded units of bodyguard infantry in the game, really. They have most of what you need other than anti-cavalry. We have the Durin's Warborn. We mentioned the monstrous cavalry before, the Bull Riders. Again, not necessarily as quick or as agile as the Elven cavalry, but still have that mass. Very, very dangerous to infantry forces when they clatter into them. Guardians of the Blue Mountains are the Javelin unit I mentioned earlier in comparison to the Mithlond Marines. They do basically the same thing for the Dwarves in the sense they're Javelins, but they are also a very accomplished melee fighter as well. The High Thanes of Azagal, Javelins combined with Halberds, that is a very potent mix indeed. And the Marksmen of Thorin's Halls as well, so I mean they've set up their stakes, so that's going to be something which the Dwarves themselves will have to be a little bit careful of, but certainly the Elves will as they try to charge in with their own cav. We've got more Marksmen of Thorin's Halls there with Spear Guard, the Frost Spears, the Repeaters. Very dangerous over a longer period of time. Whether they will have the opportunity to get that consistent fire given the nature of the battle remains to be seen. And then Wardens of Thorin's Halls as well, a very well-rounded unit of infantry. This will be, again, it'll be interesting to see how Lindon and ERED LUIN get excuse me, get on with each other in melee here. They achieve similar results really through very different means. We've got Spear Guard once again, this one from CBE Craft 811. We've got more Guardians of the Blue Mountains. I'd imagine similar armies here, to be honest. Frost Spears of Azagal, High Thanes, more Juggernauts, of course. I mean, you can't hide the Juggernauts because of those big Shogun 2 style flags they have on their backs. So the enemy will certainly see where they are as a dangerous unit. Stone Hewers, I mean, armor piercing, not necessarily that important in the grand scheme of things. It will be useful against Arthedain, but in general, I think the rank and file and the regular survivable units will be the more important thing, certainly early on as they have to take on that Lindon pincer attack. Defenders of the Blue Mountains, so the regular Dwarven units usually can have a bit of a leg up in terms of efficient quality, but not necessarily true against the Elves. Juggernauts up on the hill here from Colonel Speaks. And then finally, back over here we have more of Colonel Speaks' army actually, with High Thanes, more Frost Spears, and then we've got Guardians of the Blue Mountains, more Defenders. So yeah, pretty much the same sort of thing. You know what you're going to get really with the Dwarves in this sort of situation. They're going to bring a fair amount of their quality, and they're going to be dependent on it to really pull its weight this time, because they can't rely on overwhelming quality like they can against forces of Orcs. When it comes to facing down the Elves, it's a far more even playing field, as we mentioned. But yes, I think, without further ado, we shall get this show on the road immediately. So it begins. Now these long-range arrows, I mean, the downside to the Dwarves, of course, is the fact that being sandwiched in between a willing ambush like this is always going to be a little bit of a tricky spot. But I do think in terms of the matchup here, the fact that their armour does give them a significant edge over Lindon and the Hobbits in certain aspects, and they do have the quality to at least be able to go toe-to-toe with a force of Elves as well, although they are pretty quickly managing to be able to slip the net here. They are going to need some of these units to maybe get into a position where they can slam into the sides of these forces a little bit more quickly than they're currently able to do. But yeah, the path to the fortress very much open as it stands, and Lindon on both sides may be less eager to press the attack immediately than they could have been. This does of course mean that the Dwarves will be able to shelter somewhat within the fortress, or maybe even completely, based on how this has been going. I mean, the Knights of Innuminus are one unit which should be able to catch up to them, as are the Horse Lords of Ulmo, wherever they may be. A little bit surprised they haven't made their way in immediately, to be honest, but we are seeing some Elves now, and some of these units will get picked off, perhaps.
defenders of the Blue Mountains will probably do fairly poorly in comparison to the Lindon infantry. In fact, with all of this going on, this is one of the moments where half speed is going to come in pretty handy. Knights of Annúminas actually having their own charge blocked a little bit by the Elves of Lindon, but this is a little bit of a chaotic situation. The Knights of Annúminas are going to have to be very careful because the stakes here almost cover the entire valley. They're going to have to try and squeeze their way around. Of course, if they can get into defensive shape, the dwarves will be pretty comfortable there, you would imagine, and with 2 stone giants, the ambushers certainly do have the throwing projectiles to be able to deal with them reasonably efficiently, but they do need to bear that in mind. All sorts of Ulmo with a charge on them as well might be a way to really burn through those hit points that the stone giants do have. Lindon riders, I mean, the upshot to this is, of course, the dwarves aren't really getting any kills in return. The kills are fairly nominal for the elves, men and hobbits, but they are still slowly adding them up. Now that takes quite a lot of discipline, actually, to walk your cavalry through the stakes. The stakes will only do damage, after all, if you are at a gallop or a charge. So well done there from Farkin. That's, I mean, considering this is the only unit that you're microing, that is probably okay, but still. Going back onto the other side of the stakes now as well, so having another go at it. Crossbeers getting caught. Now this is a unit that they will want to prevent getting into the fortress, because if they get dug into a position with a good firing line, they can do a lot of very consistent damage, especially to a force like Lindon. That would be very much something they would be wishing to avoid. There's a few units of Juggernauts as well, who, I mean, they'll be difficult to bring down even when they're getting utterly overwhelmed and swamped, but again, this is where Lindon's higher than average, or much higher than average quality in pure melee terms can come into effect, because even their basic units will do a pretty decent job of not dying to the Juggernauts, and then the damage can ratchet up from there with their superior numbers. Defenders of the Blue Mountain victory is a distinct possibility. That's somewhat surprising. Lindon infantry should be beating them in melee, but especially considering how stretched the unit is, so that will probably start to flick into their favour pretty quickly, I would imagine. Another unit of the defenders being used as a bit of a rear guard as well. Stone hewers, some of these units actually now being sent onto a bit of a counter-attacking mission, and why not? It is the long bottom mob that are completely exposed here. A little bit surprised by that. Stone hewers will do the business there pretty easily. Lithlon Swordmasters will turn that fight around pretty quickly, but still, that's again good awareness. And we've got the Guardians of the Blue Mountains moving in as well for some javelin support. Things are developing, but not necessarily in the way that I was expecting right from the off here. Stone Giant is here in battling Brandybucks. They do at least have armor piercing, so in theory they can do a bit of damage to the Stone Giant, but I really don't think they're going to do enough to make that worth it. When it comes to pure infantry that are just being thrown against that kind of unit, it can withstand an absolutely huge amount of punishment. More of the units now making their way back to the keep within the Blue Mountains. The other Stone Giants still not being utilised just yet. And the Knights of Annúminas moving forward. I mean, this is a unit of spears, but because of how thinly they're placed and also in loose formation, a charge would still be enough to pretty much rip a hole right through them. And you should be able to then cycle out pretty quickly. He thought twice about that right before the charge connected. Stone hewers now retreating once more. In fact, if they were to lose a unit, they probably would have preferred the Stone hewers to the Guardians of the Blue Mountains, because this would be an incredibly useful unit of javelins when it comes to defending the fortress at the back end of the map. So maybe they will live to regret committing this unit in over here. Pikes and other such elven units. I mean, there's a more direct route to the fortress over here as well, which the elves are certainly going to take. The dwarves also need to get into position pretty quickly over there, because the elves could actually be contesting the walls before the dwarven defence is actually set up, so there is still a bit of a race on here. There's still a few units of dwarves way back here. Harland Infantry, Mithlon Swordmasters. Yeah, the Knights of Anuminous recharging into these units that were left behind, and that will very much hasten the demise of those that were left behind. Arthedain marksmen, so we're starting to see some of the infantry from the human faction as well. And yeah, Mithlon Swordmasters, the other unit of defenders of the Blue Mountains. Far denser formation now, but again, it's a situation where the Elven infantry would pretty handily beat them if left to its own devices, but I would imagine the Knights of Anuminous are going to help with this engagement as well, or another unit of Elven infantry. Either one works, and this is a situation where you could see even the stout-hearted dwarves start to rout. Then the Guardians of the Blue Mountains trying to flee and actually managing to do so without routing so far, but I can't imagine that will stay the case with the cavalry harrying them. And then Elven units starting to get in over here as well. So it was probably the right call for the dwarves to just absolutely bolt towards the fortress, because getting caught in the valley meant that they wouldn't have been able really to put on a full defence of their fort, whereas now they will, but they have also been the ones to take far more consistent damage at the hands of their foes, the Horse Lords of Ulmo. Yeah, in terms of getting involved in a cavalry fight like this, they're far superior to the Durin's Warborn. Shot cavalry through and through, really, are the Warboars from ERED LUIN, which could have had its place, but no longer. The other Horse Lords of Ulmo charging into the Juggernauts as well. That's a really good pick-off. So again, this is valuable damage that the attackers are doing, and they will need to, because like I said, once the dwarves get into a defensive shape in the fortress, they'll be very difficult to dislodge, and Lindon and the Hobbits in particular are not really designed for that kind of battle. Arthedain slightly more so, but not really on the level that ERED LUIN are really capable of. Meanwhile, this is going about as well as you would expect for a bunch of hobbit farmers going up against a stone giant. More and more elves banking up, so a really significant force over on this side of the battlefield actually. There is another route they could take around by the looks of it. Yes indeed. A bit of a long route though, and it does end up in the same place, unlike on the other side. And there is no option to attack through the other angles of the fortress, only two of the walls available to be struck. Crossbears. Defenders of the Blue Mountains as well. I mean, the Spear Guard are a little bit more of a serious spear unit than the ones we've seen up to this point. Still, the Stone Giant looks fine. And also, the Stone Giant, I mean, it's a little bit counterintuitive, but he wasn't bloodied for quite a long time. It's only really just happened. I think they're trying to get the charge bonus off with the Battling Brandybucks, which will increase the effectiveness of them slightly, but... and then there they all go. I mean, I suppose just going in again and again with these two units that aren't going to be particularly valuable for attacking the fort, and just trying to wear this unit down as much as possible isn't the worst idea in the world. And then over here... now we can go up to 1 speed, but yes. Defenders of the Blue Mountains still just about hanging on. 60 of them. So we have already seen some evidence of that dwarven morale, which could be something they fall back on as this fight goes on. Obviously the elves can certainly hang with them, but the hobbits certainly won't, and neither will Arthedain really. Skin changers jogging around in the midfield. Lindon riders just launching a few more arrows in. Spears. Again, just trying again, and this has been certainly a very effective tool for them, the cavalry, the Horse Lords of Ulmo and the Knights of Anuminous. They'll be significantly less effective in the mid part of this battle when it comes to trying to break into the fortress. If they are going to be effective again, it will be in the very late game to try and finally bring the enemy down. Horse Lords. A little bit more depleted now, but again they have been in and amongst a fair amount of Dwarven Spears, so that is to be expected. Harlan infantry there in the far field. Some more Spear Guards, so again another unit that was caught and left to be picked off. I mean, that Stone Giant will ultimately be picked off as well, and indeed there he is, he's dead in the distance. Looks like the Skin Changers got involved at some point. So I mean, fair play, I mean that is a lot of dead hobbits, but they must have done that heavy lifting. That cycle charging from infantry is not something you see be terribly effective an awful lot of the time, because peeling infantry off of an engagement often leaves them way more damage than it's worth them being, unlike with cavalry. But against a single entity unit, it's not really too much of a concern. So a good use of the charge bonus there of the battle in Brandybucks. Meanwhile, Knights of Anumas once again just trying to kill off as many of those dwarves as possible before they get in through the gates. But this is where the dwarves will be hoping they can change things up a little bit. But as I was kind of expecting, the elves have been able to get into a position where they can contest this defence before the dwarves were fully set, although they have been able to make it so the elves have not really been able to establish a full front line and manage to gain full control over the walls, which would have been the holy grail for Lindon over here, but not so. Stonehewers up on the walls, who won't do too well, I think, in the long run against Harlan infantry, but just getting something to resist them, I think, was the key. Juggernauts, along with more Spear Guard, that's a pretty significant front line, and they will be able to hold the push at the gates. The Ram phasing through the wall. And then Harlan infantry, and again, more Juggernauts up on the walls. So it's going to take something pretty serious to bring them down. The Stonehewers. Again, the Mithlon Swordmasters will do pretty well against most things, but the Juggernauts might be a bridge too far for them. It's going to come down to numbers, weirdly enough, for the elves. This is the sort of generic Dwarven settlement layout as well, which has these raised walkways, which is very useful for internal defence. It allows you to do exactly what the Frost Spears are doing here, whether it's firing at units on the walls or whether it's containing a situation on the ground. It's far more conducive to allowing Medieval 2 to get good shots off rather than the outer walls where you end up looping your shots instead of firing them straight down. Juggernauts holding the front line with what's remaining of that Spear Guard, and again it's coming down to Harlan infantry trying to push their way in. Yeah, and this is a situation that Lindon certainly don't find themselves in too much of the time, having to be a bit of a bludgeon with sheer numbers, but I mean, in theory that's not a bad place for them to be, because if they are able to do that, then they should be able to rely upon their quality as well. You can see that the Dwarven settlement dimensions are a little bit peculiar because of where the siege tower is, but it works. You know, we've got the some elves up on the walls, and there are the High Thanes. Haven't seen them get involved in combat just yet. And then the Frost Spears continuing. I mean, this is where you can see how devastating these volleys are going to be to a force like Lindon. And then there's javelins coming in as well. Juggernauts and Stonehewers either side, so that is a real kill box. And all of the damage that the dwarves took during their retreat through the valley being repaid in full now, you would suggest. This is where the attackers are going to have to try and be a little bit savvy. It's going to be difficult, I think, as a force like Lindon or the Hobbits to be able to avoid taking pretty dire losses here. I mean, they do have Arthedain as well, but I don't think Arthedain's armour is going to necessarily be enough to withstand the Frost Spears and Javelins coming their way anyway. But also I think another key to this battle is going to be getting all of these numbers in a position where they can be a little bit more useful. As many angles of attack as possible, because then there's only so many things that the dwarves can target. And then through numbers you can try and buckle in certain areas and then flood through. The textbook attacker approach. just not necessarily with textbook attacker factions. Marksman of Thorin's Hall's getting involved now as well. Maybe not as damaging as some of the other units of projectiles ERED LUIN have, but very reliable certainly. Arthedains of course as well, and again it's Lindon infantry and Mithril swordmasters. Strange unit to have as your rank and file in a situation like this, and the dwarves actually pushing out of the gate now, which is probably not what they want to do, because as soon as they do that, that's feeding some good value to the attackers. Of course we have to remember that ERED LUIN are the evil ones in this situation, having accepted the gift of the rings. So in many ways we should be rooting for the attackers this time, I suppose. Get off the walls now as well. I mean, seeing that perhaps this is not necessarily the way to go about things. I mean, ultimately they're going to have to, but I think they need to do so through more than just 2 siege towers. They need to have at least 4 or 5 on this side. Continue to attack over here as well. Always darkest before the dawn, as they say, and they're going to need to try and just weather this storm, but do so with a little bit more of a concentrated attack, I think. A lot of the Arthedainians moving in over here now as well. We see the stone giant outside of the walls, which maybe isn't the call. Skin changers are over here, who certainly will be able to do pretty significant damage to the stone giant. Don't know why he came out here, to be honest. Maybe trying to force through, cause a bit of disruption on the front line, but that wasn't really necessary because they were looking pretty comfortable over here. But yeah, and there he goes. Monstrous infantry with how much damage they can do individually is another way that you can bring them down, and the skin changes as one of the scariest classes of unit, one of the scariest units in that class, able to bring them down. That one Lindon Mariner looked like he got crushed by it, but he managed to get back up again. Cross spears. Another angle of them as well. The Lindon pikes being committed before the Arthedainian ones over here. An intriguing choice, to be sure. Mithril pikes should do quite nicely if left to their own devices, but you would imagine that that will not really be the case with all of these projectiles flying around. Another example of, I think this is more of an example of them trying to, because normally this settlement would not have cliffs on each side of it, so this is an example of the siege tower doing that thing where its siege weaponry slides down cliff sides. And technically speaking, these are walls and such that you can interact with, but yeah, obviously because of the geometry of the map, it's not going to work. Lindon infantry winning this fight now, being joined by some hobbitry in arms, killing off a few more of the spear guard. Any sort of efficient kill that they can score at this point is something the attackers will certainly take, having had their noses well and truly bloodied during the initial attempt to storm the walls. Hobbits now leading the way, more elves. Ladders side on to the walls. They've actually managed to clear off a pretty good spot here. If they can get another unit up here, then they can start filtering units down off the walls and establishing a little bit more of a beachhead. Over here things are looking a little bit more desperate with the Arthedains joining in the fight, but that is a sign they're out of javelin ammunition, so every cloud. Don't know how much ammunition those frost spears still have left, but they have significantly more in the stockpile than most javelins will have, so more where that came from. The elves, I mean, there's a huge amount of dead elves on the walls here already, and still that same unit of juggernauts is here, still going to be able to pretty easily hold at bay those Lindon infantry. And then dull thud of the repeaters beginning once again. The Wardens of Thorin's Hall taking a little bit of damage by the looks of things, but then in melee terms, that is the nature of the beast when it comes to the 2 furthest west factions on mainland Middle-earth. Melee defense is certainly a priority for both, so it's always going to be a fairly savage encounter in pure melee terms. Javelin infantry routing, 67 of them routing as well. Mythlon Marines up on the walls now as well. Marksman of Thorin's Halls. We've got people flying off the ladders as well, which is an interesting animation, I suppose, because I guess that's the archers hitting them and them getting knocked off, which theoretically would normally only be possible from this side of the wall, which would be a very rare thing to see. But I guess because of the slightly strange geometry of this settlement based on the custom parameters, we're able to see it from this side. Juggernauts and Frostspears, still plenty of high quality units left in reserve, waiting for the opportunity. The High Thanes, especially in a situation where it's a very narrow linear engagement, they should do pretty damn well in this sort of situation. Frostspears continue to fire in. Thanes. Using more of that javelin ammunition. I mean, this is a fairly dense blob of attackers now. It's only worth firing into. It's a relatively thin front line of dwarves as well, but there's again some really high quality here when you factor in the juggernauts. Mountains. Are they out of ammunition? It looks like it with their swords and shields drawn. So another unit of infantry to try and reinforce this, again, thinning front line. Defeat seems almost certain. High Thanes out of ammunition by the looks of things, as they were trundling towards the front lines with their halberds drawn. Meanwhile, this is looking like a fairly desperate situation for the dwarves on the front line now as well, with Arthedain starting to throw their numbers behind. And using a general's ability as well. Defeat is a distinct possibility because of the huge amount of damage they're now taking. I mean, javelins, archers, repeaters, all of it is being dumped into this blob to try and blunt its momentum as much as possible. There are 2 units of High Thanes that are able to set up another front line, but the problem is they could just be swamped as that force just overwhelms the dwarven numbers. That would be the main concern. Does this unit still have ammunition? I would imagine that's the whole purpose behind them coming over here. And the marksmen are all well and good, but Arthedain are the faction that are best suited for dealing with regular arrow fire. Less so for the javelins, of course. Frostspears out of ammunition, so they're just being committed to the front line to try and cover any gaps. Looks like another unit of them is doing the same as well. Of course, even thoroughly focused dwarven skirmishers will always be able to fall back on the fact that they generally have very good armour, so they can just be an armoured dwarf just standing in the way of the enemy as they advance. And in this situation, that is going to be just as valuable. Another unit of those Frostspears doing some raking shots on Lindon and the Shire as they try to move in through this gate. It's trying to squeeze through. I mean, the issue here is going to be that I don't know if the Hobbits' mentality is going to hold out. Far and away the most likely faction on the field today to rout. They're going to give it a go anyway. And then securing a section of wall, fighting for this one as well. High Thanes backed up against the wall. Are they getting surrounded somewhat? This is a separate unit of High Thanes. So again, the wall's still being contested, although in places now the attackers are starting to gain the upper hand. This Frostling thrower should probably have been moved over to this side of the map, but artillery is so slow that they need to try and make a decision on what they're going to be doing with that as quickly as possible. Oof. And then Wardens of Thorin's Halls, there were some javelins coming down from the units up on the wall as well. That is a pretty grisly situation for the Arthedainians to be in, but also kind of a necessary one. If they are able to break through after all, it's going to lead to a momentum shift I don't think the Dwarves would recover from, but when you go all in, or mostly all in by the looks of things, like this, it does mean that the price of failure is probably a loss in the battle overall. Again, like I said, this isn't the longest battle in the world for a custom scenario like this, so the fact that everyone's willing to be aggressive like this is certainly one of the main reasons for that. More pikes moving in. That'll be something else which does concern ERED LUIN. If it does come down to it, pikes are going to be a real issue for them late on, especially seeing as they're being forced really into using all of their ammo stocks. Defenders of Fornos. One thing that was notable in the composition phases as well was the relative lack of bodyguard tier units that the attackers do have access to. So they've got plenty of numbers, but the bleeding edge quality, not necessarily. Don't know whose general ability that was. Was that the elves? Possibly. I would imagine this is the sort of situation where the Frost Spears are going to have an absolutely monstrous kill count. We have seen that before, and this is pretty much set up for them to be one of the main anchors behind the Dwarven efforts. Their infantry is strong, but that's just designed to really be the force by which they hold everything at bay. ERED LUIN in particular, of course, have got that focus around ranged units. There goes one of the generals. At the hands of the hobbits? Surely not. Yeah. So, and was that the hobbits? Yeah. Yeah, there he is, down on the ground. A few battling brandy bucks. Well, that's an unfortunate and inglorious end. I'd understand if it was the skin changes, but they hadn't even arrived yet. They were lagging behind. Well, they're here now. And they're going to be causing problems for the Dwarves on this flank, and that will allow a little bit of a... What's that unit back there? Juggernauts. I guess that's the Keeper of the Rings back there, keeping them safe, relatively speaking. Backs to the walls job that this is. Victory seems certain for the Dwarves on the front line for now, but more Elven pikes are on the way forwards. More units can be piled in, and there's still enough reinforcements over here that they're not going to run their supply dry too soon. I think that's more of a concern over on this side, given how they have gone so gung-ho, which I actually do approve of. There is the bodyguard tier unit, though, the High Lords of Annuminous that we mentioned. Arthedain bringing their finest. And in this regard, actually, because the ERED LUIN Dwarves don't really have a sword and board bodyguard unit, they are better than what ERED LUIN has in this regard. There's another general, a defender of Fornos, running him through. The one-handed hammer and shield combination. A true dwarven weapon setup if ever I've seen one. Still, I mean, do they have the endurance to be able to get through here still? Lindon Mariner is able to somewhat get in behind enemy lines, but immediately now being targeted down by the Frost Spears. They have been able as well to actually force the Frostling throwers off of the artillery pieces, which is worth it. I mean, they will be able to remount it, but that delay is just going to allow them to keep that artillery silent for a longer period of time, and now the Knights of Annuminous, who were so effective earlier, are now going to be able to cause some real chaos and keep that artillery silent. More Frost Spears doing their thing. I mean, there's a lot of pikes still on this front line. In a long engagement, that might be okay. And the The Lancers did come down, but I don't know if that was necessarily a full charge. I mean, some of the High Thanes did die, so I guess it was, but it wasn't necessarily as devastating as it could have been, but this next one might be. And now with shock cavalry here, able to punch a few holes in this front line. Maybe keeping the Frostling thrower silent is no longer entirely necessary, especially with the Harland infantry able to fill that role anyway. It's damaging and it's worrying times for the dwarves. That was a better charge, but it was again on a thinner section of the line, weirdly enough. Starting to make their way forwards. Again, things are happening all throughout the settlement now, so let's just take a quick stock of this. Skin changes, again, getting some juggernauts that were left behind. This could be the passage of play in the battle where things turn against the defenders. I don't know if they can necessarily recover from this. They do have a nice final stand position, as you would expect from the dwarves. High Thanes, a few units of Juggernauts in various states of repair. Frost Spears, Horns of Thorns all celebrating. I don't know if I'd be celebrating in this situation. Better be steeling yourselves for what's to come. But yeah, they do have enough to make a real fist of it, but I do think they're going to need something like the Frostling Thrower to get into a good position to get some more consistent damage off. Because if that isn't the case, I don't know how they dig themselves out of this. They could try and rely on their quality in such a narrow final stand, I suppose, again, given the significantly lower amount of bodyguard troops that the attackers have access to, but then there's still going to be stuff like the skin changes to consider, pikes as well, are kind of the great equaliser in that sort of situation anyway. Bowman. Still the Frost Spears. Taking some pot shots, trying to kill off a few of the Noldering Guard. That'll be another unit that will be very useful when it comes to that final confrontation. Still a unit of High Thanes though, up on this wall. Arthedain marksmen, some Warns of the North. They won't have used up any of their ammunition either. Again, it's going to be relatively difficult though to get some good shots off here. Best bet might be to try and get on that wall and then loop them over. Again, as you would expect from a dwarven settlement, its defensive shape and positions are all going to be very conducive to digging in and trying to see things out. Are they going to be able to do so though? Lond. More pikes. High Lords of Illuminas. And Lindar Bowman. Firing some shots across as well. Trying to finish things off as quickly as they can over here. High Thanes, are they going to be able to save any of these units now? I don't think they will. I think things are mostly cut off. Which again, another unit of those Thanes would have been very welcome. They don't have the range of the pikes, of course, but we know how effective they can be. It's just going to have to be a case of trying to kill off as many of the attackers as possible and try and deny them as much of that numbers advantage as they possibly can. Sorts of low. Again, a bit more of a clumsy bump more so than a full-blooded charge that, but might be enough to start routing some of the lesser dwarves off, not so much the High Thanes. And our bows. Thanes. 13 of them only remain. this. The announcer is seeing the writing on the wall as well, I think. And then another charge from the Knights of Annuminus. Here, Turkish hunters claiming this defensive position, trying to loop their shots over again. There's a lot to try and navigate here, but at this point, again, just using all of this to try and get the odd kill here and there is probably worth it for the attackers, because I think they've got enough credit in the bank now that if they can just keep their foot on the neck, they should be able to see this one through. Again, a few more stragglers. These guys still have ammunition though. Good opportunity for a bit of a kill zone. Do they have enough? Are they going to be able to get this Frostling thrower into position? I think that's probably going to be the dwarves' last hope. If they can, then that's a lot of damage they can do. If they can't, I don't really know what else. Again, I think as well, once you get up onto these walls, is there not... I can't recall if you can go from here up to here, based along the walls, in a similar way that you kind of can in Helm's Deep. I can't recall. There are these doorways here, but I don't know if that's the case or not. Again, this may be one of the generic settlements, or like the generic Dwarven fortress, I think it is, or castle, one of the two. But you don't see it all that often, really. It's the sort of thing that you'll see in campaign, in Divide and Conquer, this sort of thing, more so than in these set-piece battles in Reforged. Now as they move forwards, victory seems certain, still for the dwarves, which is not a bad effort, honestly. Only a fool could lose this battle. Continuing to pile forward with wardens as well. Trying to use, again, these frost spears. I do look forward to seeing the kill counts of these guys. And yes, you can. Okay. That changes things up pretty significantly, actually, I think. If it was just the one angle that they could defend, I think the dwarves, there was a way, if they were able to use their artillery, that they might have been able to do the business. But as it stands, there is actually, I think, another route around this way as well. So I think that's too much of a game of whack-a-mole for the dwarves to be able to play and have any sort of success from this point on. I mean, the attackers are dragging their heels a little bit when it comes to getting a lot of these units into the action. Some skin changes are moving up onto the walls now, though, as well, so that's going to be a sight that the dwarves are not going to be too pleased about seeing. And then, Guardians of the Blue Mountains. I mean, this does give them actually a good opportunity to utilise their Frostling thrower. The heftier version of the Frostling spears. You can see how quickly they devastated the hobbits there, but again, I think they need a fairly linear arc of fire, which means the area where they would be most interested in deploying this artillery, the main approach up to the town centre, is not going to be one that they're easily going to be able to find an angle for. It's also a bit of a frame rate destroyer by the looks of things, this artillery piece. That's a good sign of something that's truly devastating, I suppose. The elves starting to surround the dwarven resistance that was defending the main approach. Actually, that's a good point. What is the cause of this absolute dumping of the frame rate? Well, no matter. Now we're starting to recover a little bit. Usually when the frames start to drop like this, it's usually based on architecture and the destruction of said architecture. Ah, they are able to get an angle. Well, that's going to do a lot of damage. It's quite late to try and mount a comeback, but at the very least it's going to be pretty devastating. Some Noldorin Guard on the walls over there, though, attacking through the other way, and they're going to be a little bit more of a problem than the Hobbits were. Juggernauts have been dispatched, but the Noldorin Guard, I think, are in significantly better condition. There's a lot of arrows flying over the walls as well. Everyone that hits a dwarf and does even just a little bit of damage is going to be a problem for them. Turning around again and now targeting the elves. I mean, this goes to show that how good a job the attackers did of silencing this thing a little bit earlier on with those infantry units, and then later the cavalry. So if that was able to shoot into that Arthedain blob on the outer gates, it would have been really devastating, doing even more damage than they already took performing that manoeuvre. Bottom mob throwing their stones in, significantly less damaging of course, but again, every bit of damage that the dwarves take at this point. I mean, I think this is already a bridge too far, really. Every dwarf lost only makes that more the case. Frost spears ready. Another general ability. Again, that's one of the elves or the hobbits. I'd imagine it's the elves. Each general ability does something slightly different, and it's fairly significant when you have it in these custom battles. Flaming arrows. Trying to bring down the artillery pieces. Tried and true method in this version of the game. It used to be relatively ineffective. It used to be possible, but it used to not really fire a lot of the time. But the chance of it has increased now. Definitely a very valid tactic. Got this frame rate, the Frostling thrower. That has to be what it is, because there's no walls being crumbled, and even then I think this is it's a relatively stable architecture set. Ooh, Arthedain. Let's have a look. Yeah, 10% is the difference, but I mean the thing is 10% of a dwarven army is not an awful lot of troops. It's not for the elves either, but when you factor in the humans and the hobbits, those numbers start to become a little bit lopsided late on. But then again, the quality. You can't afford to get too complacent here, the attackers, because I mean, if they do end up in a situation where they have to try and brute force their way through Juggernauts and High Thanes with a bunch of trash, then they're not going to be able to make that work. Noldorin Guard closing down the Frost Spears. Skin changes moving forward as well. That should be enough to bring them down. And then surely the latest wave of elves also making their way up through the main approach, so it looks as though the rings are going to be confiscated. Sauron's potential new western ally scuppered before they could ever really get going. Yeah, Arthedain Marksman thought so. Still that frame rate. And it's quite rare these days that you have one of these battles where the frame rate... I mean, I know that we had that Dale one a few weeks back now, another custom scenario, but that one was a little bit more understandable because it was such a huge blob of infantry. This is far more manageable, which is why I would be inclined to blame the artillery. See those pebbles being launched through the air against the backdrop of the tower. Oof, boy. Juggernauts. Yeah, High Lords of Numinous, that fight is only going in one direction. When the frame rate takes a huge nosedive like this, it's almost nostalgic. That was what it was like in some of the bigger scenarios in the in some of the old days of Reforged. Less so now, but still. Obviously from a viewing perspective, I imagine this is perhaps not the greatest in the late game here. which is why I've been trying to move the camera a little bit less. But at least it was only towards the tail end of things. Frostling Thrower, I would blame you. And the Arthedain marksmen have not been able to set fire to it, which I guess is somewhat accurate because it's more metal really than wood. The Juggernauts and the High Thanes still hanging on to the front line, but I think ultimately they are going to be surrounded. Are they fleeing? No, 13 of them are heading over to try and prevent any sort of overlap. But I don't think they're going to be successful in this regard. I'm surprised, actually. There's only so many frames left, and yet these dwarves... I guess it may come down to the fact that the Dwarven General's got the rings, so as soon as he falls, it's like, well, that's it. And considering he must have been committed to the front, his days are looking fairly numbered at this stage. Victory is almost a certainty. Only a fool could lose this battle. Well, skin changers are on their way across, the elves with their Noldering Guard. Again, because of the frame drops, it has actually been effectively running at half speed, but still, I mean, considering the dwarves, when the dam burst on both of the outer walls at more or less the same time, it was always going to be difficult to claw it back from there. They gave a good fist of it, but in the end, their evil deeds end here, before they were ever able to make it back to Thorin's halls. Kirit Gathol, is that the other hold in the Blue Mountains? Gabil Gathol is the one in the Iron Hills, is it not? All of which are actual maps as well. Perhaps sometime soon. Yeah, there we go. I guess that's it. The rings. Keeping them all to himself, because isn't there three? Three that you get offered? Is ERED LUIN? Rather worryingly, that means there's one for the elves, one for the hobbits, and one for Arthedain if they choose to pursue their own evil deeds following their defeat here. And yeah, again, actually nice to see some lore-friendly names in here as well, I guess, for the most part, which seems to be the case with a lot of these scenarios that we've seen. But yeah, I think it was... the dwarves did make the right decision by, going full retreat through the valley, because if they allowed themselves to get stuck there, they would have been in all sorts of trouble, and the best chance of defeat was to bank up in the fort and try and use that natural dwarven defence to their advantage. But in the end, they did lose a decent amount in the valley retreat. But I think the real... that artillery, if it had been set up to counter-attack that Arthedain big push, that may very well have been the turning point. Because like I said at the time when Arthedain was doing that, if it works, it basically wins you the battle. If it doesn't work, it loses you the battle. And we saw how potent the artillery could be. Perhaps it's a good thing they didn't, though, because I think the frame rate probably would have been taking a nosedive far quicker than it otherwise would have been. But yeah, I think that was probably the key to the battle. I mean, saving a few extra units from the outside would have helped as well. From an attacking perspective, I don't really know what else they could have done. They maybe could have been a little bit more aggressive to pursue the dwarves earlier on to try and get even more kills done out there. But in so doing, they may very well have lost a few cavalry units to stakes in their haste. And considering the cavalry was also very useful in the interior of the settlement actually as well, at the opportune moment, maybe it was best to exercise that extra bit of caution, and it did pay dividends later on. And ultimately as well, considering the makeup of the forces here, again, 3 Lindon and 1 Hobbit army, it's not necessarily their happy place to be in the attack like this when they have to be super aggressive. But ultimately they managed that quite well, and obviously Arthedain a little bit more at home in that regard. But when you're facing off against a force like the Dwarves, you do need to be very deliberate in what you're doing and have a clear idea. And I think the attackers did that. I think they executed early on reasonably well, and then they were able to keep that momentum up into the fortress. They never allowed themselves to get fully thrown out of the fortress and have to start again. You know, it started off fairly rough for them, but then they were able to sort of double down on a full attack, and that did end up ultimately being the decision, I think, which won them the battle. But let's see what did the damage for the Dwarves. Yeah, and unsurprisingly, the High-Thanes and the Frost Spears, the MVPs for them. Some of the Juggernauts, of course, got caught outside of the walls, which is worth mentioning, but 708 on the High-Thanes. Big. I mean, the thing that the High-Thanes have in comparison to the Frost Spears is the fact that they're also very strong in melee. The Frost Spears, I mean, they're decent in melee, but the vast majority of their damage comes from their repeaters, whereas the Javelins and the Halberds do the damage for the High-Thanes, really. Guardians to the Blue Mountains, so again, ranged units doing the business. Stone Giant only 32. That might have been the one that tried to counterattack outside the walls. That was a fairly disastrous call as well, I think. If they had a Stone Giant in the interior, that could have made a real difference late on. The next army, again, High-Thanes, Frost Spears. This unit of Frost Spears only getting 2, but I imagine that's because they were caught outside the walls. 980 on the High-Thanes, so it isn't the Frost Spears really that's the MVP here. It is once again the High-Thanes proving themselves to be an absolutely monstrous unit in all aspects. Certainly a very, also a very aesthetically pleasing unit, I would suggest. Ooh, 666, that's a worrying sight for the High-Thanes. I guess they were on the evil side today. 564, and again the Frost Spears. Yeah, Marksman doing a decent job. Wards of Thorin's Halls, again 200, that's not bad. You have to remember that they're going up against a largely elven force, so kills in melee are also going to be sort of worth a little bit more than they would be against your rank and file Orcish or Evil Men faction, for example. 443 for the Frostling Throw, and a lot of that was done late on. If they had been deployed a little bit earlier, that could have been a truly devastating number. But like I said, I think another thing the attackers did very well was to prevent that from happening with both infantry and cavalry after finding those gaps in the wake of Arthedain's big push. So yeah, big thank you to Colonel Speaks and to Flame of Arnor, who I think both developed this scenario. That's true of a few that we've seen from them over the course of the last few weeks. This was the last one in this batch, like I mentioned. There was another one, but it was effectively a very slightly edited version of the Numenor attack across the river scenario that we saw a few weeks back, so that's one that I'm going to leave on the back burner for now. There are a few other custom maps and scenarios that I have been sent, however, by other people. So Tommy has sent me one, and I think there's another one that's running which I hope to be a part of soon. And also the Womb Raider has sent me, I think that's not a custom scenario, I think that's just a custom map, but I mean, from the outside perspective, it doesn't make too much of a difference really when things are set up just so. So there's a couple more custom maps which I will be showing first. They of course always get priority over the regular ones. But I've also been sent a few others. Like there's still a lot in my backlog. Like Thanatos sent me some a while back, which I will get to. Don't worry, I will get to all of them. I have got a much better system for keeping track of everything now than I used to. So nothing's going to fall through the cracks. It's just that things may take a little while to actually show themselves as a result of things being sent in now. And also there is one on Thranduil's Halls, which is a standard set piece map, which we haven't seen in a while. That one will show up at some stage as well. But yeah, big thank you to Flame of Arnor and Colonel Speaks and to all the players who are part of this battle replay and for all of the scenarios we've seen of late. Hopefully a new batch will come out in a little while. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed this and hope you'll join me for whatever is next.